This morning's session is called The Pursuit of Objectivity, and the moderator this morning is Tom Charity, who is a writer, a programmer, and a critic. Tom was film editor for Time Out London for 5 years before he moved to Vancouver in 2004. He's a film critic for CNN.com and for LoveFilm.com. He's a regular contributor to Sight and Sound, CinemaScope, the International Film Guide, Uncut, and the London Times. And his books include John Cassavetes' Life Works, The Right Stuff, and The Rough Guide to Film, and the Time Out City Guide to Vancouver, of which he was the editor. He also programs the Vancity Theatre, this theatre here, year-round for the Vancouver International Film Festival Group. The session today is sponsored by Rogers, to whom we are very grateful, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you. I'd like to introduce our panelists. To my immediate left, Lisa Leeman. She writes, produces, directs, and edits documentaries. And her most recent work is the featured documentary One Lucky Elephant, which is showing here in VIF. It's the story of one man's determined quest to find a permanent home for the 28-year-old African elephant he adopted and made the star of his circus. That old story. Lisa produced the feature documentary Crazy Wisdom, The Life and Times of Choyam Trungpa, which is also in the festival, which profiles the influential and provocative Tibetan Buddhist teacher and his impact on the West. She also directed the feature documentary Out of Faith, which is not in the festival, as far as I know, an emotional, character-driven film that explores conflicts over interfaith marriage and assimilation as seen through 3 generations of a family headed by Holocaust survivors. Leeman has collaborated with many acclaimed filmmakers, including the renowned cinematographer Haskell Wexler, with whom she co-directed and edited Who Needs Sleep? Lisa is currently co-directing with Paolo Di Florio a feature documentary on the life and teachings of the renowned Swami Paramahansa Yogananda,
Very good.
a modern mystic who laid the groundwork for yoga in the United States. And Lisa has served as a judge at the Sundance Film Festival, the president of the International Documentary Association, on the boards of the IDA, the National Coalition of Independent Public Broadcasting Producers. She sits on the faculty of USC and has taught documentary filmmaking in Beijing and Amman, Jordan. And honors include Sundance Film Festival's Filmmakers Trophy for her groundbreaking film Metamorphosis, Man into Woman, an Emmy nomination, and the once-in-a-lifetime American Film Institute Independent Filmmaker Grant. And before that, Lisa spent a decade editing many award-winning social issue documentaries. In the middle there, we have Peter Richardson. Peter is a Portland-based filmmaker, and he's also in VIF with How to Die in Oregon. The film won the Grand Jury Prize for Best Documentary at the 2011 Sundance Film Festival, and it was a top 10 audience favorite at Hot Docs this year. And it won the award for Best Documentary at the Ashland Independent Film Festival, and both the Center for Documentary Studies and Kathleen Bryan Edwards Human Rights Award at the 2011 Full Frame Documentary Film Festival. Peter produced, directed, photographed, and co-edited How to Die in Oregon with Greg Snyder. Richardson also directed, produced, edited, and co-photographed his debut feature, Clear Cut, the story of Philomath, Oregon, which premiered at the Sundance Film Festival in 2006 and has been broadcast on the Sundance Channel. The documentary centers on a rural Oregon timber town where a rift between conservatives and liberals threatens to put an end to a 40-year-old scholarship plan that pays the college tuition for every local high school graduate the town produces. And that film won the award for Best Documentary at the Sarasota Film Festival. And then at the far end, we have Julia Ivanova. Julia trained at the Russian Film Institute in Moscow, and in 1995, Julia immigrated to Canada and Vancouver, where she concentrated on writing, directing, and producing documentaries. Her first film was the award-winning documentary From Russia for Love, about adoption of older children, which has been televised in 26 countries. She directed, produced, and wrote the script for the film. She directed and wrote I Want a Woman, which has been shown on CBC News World and IFC. Produced, directed, wrote, and shot Moscow Freestyle, a documentary about Canadian and American English teachers that live in Moscow, her native city. In 2007, she worked as a writer and director on a one-hour documentary about gay fathers and their children, Fatherhood Dreams, for Global TV and Knowledge Network. True Love or Marriage Fraud, The Price of Heartache, was broadcast on CBC Films Network last year. Love Translated premiered at the Chicago International Film Festival. And Julia is on the board of the documentary organization of Canada BC chapter and Hot Docs Documentary Film Festival, where her film, A Family Portrait in Black and White, which is showing in VIF, was named the best Canadian feature this year. So thank you for being here. Today's topic, as Helen mentioned, is the pursuit of objectivity, which feels like a rather daunting title, but it's something that's perhaps been a bit of an onus for documentary filmmakers forever, it feels like. I think objectivity is a quality that is essential in all art, in almost any conscious thought. We look for some documentary. As soon as you put a frame around something, then you're making analytical assessments and aesthetic judgments which call on some kind of objectivity. But that pressure seems to have been particularly keen for documentary filmmakers over the years. And the reasons for that are, I think, partly historical, and because documentaries tend to be dealing with the real world, with political issues, so there are demands for balance and fairness, which were very much inherited from the John Grierson BBC tradition, and which were pretty prevalent while there was such a thing as state-sponsored broadcasting through the years. In the 1950s, you had the cinema direct movement and cinema verite, where filmmakers, in a sense, tried to rebel against that idea of there only being one voice, but by stripping away all rhetorical devices and trying to be transparent in their filmmaking, but in a way that was a movement towards greater objectivity. And yet, probably in more recent years, with the fragmentation of media and broadcasting, and the influence of first-person filmmakers, the great success of Michael Moore, for example, those received notions of balance no longer apply, I think, to documentary filmmaking as a whole. This year, for example, there have already been films pro and con Sarah Palin, neither of which was very good in my opinion, but the polemical filmmaking is very much alive and well these days. And you'll notice that the session is called The Pursuit of Objectivity, which I guess no more guarantees the attainment of objectivity than the Constitution of the United States guarantees happiness. So I think we're going to spend as much time, I hope, discussing the pursuit, the process of documentary as theoretical discussions of this thing, objectivity, whatever that may mean. We're dealing with three very different films here. A film about a retired circus elephant, a film about the right to die, physician-assisted suicide, and a film about an extended foster family in the Ukraine. But you know, it struck me after I watched Julia's film, which was the third of the films that I saw last week, they do share one central theme, and they're all concerned with love. And not only that, but something very painful, which is the renunciation, the letting go aspect of love. These are three really very moving films, and I do encourage you to catch them. And that's a difficult theme for objectivity, because as we all know, anyone who's been in love knows that objectivity is the first thing that goes out the window. So it's a very challenging theme, and I have a hunch that maybe one thing we're going to learn from this session is that objectivity may be in the eye of the beholder. It's a kind of subjective thing. But what I'd like to do to start with is to show the trailers for each of these films so that you guys have a sense of where these guys are coming from. And Lisa, we've got your film on the computer there if you'd like to press play, and we'll get that going.
I had no idea what I was getting into. It's hard to think that maybe I've made a mistake to take this elephant's life and merge it with mine.
She was captured as a baby, and it scarred her. David came along and said, I love you, but that's not enough.
Flora, stop it. She is mischievous, which as she got older I thought she might lose, but instead it's getting worse. Flora, down all the way. She just doesn't seem to be enjoying performing anymore. Go ahead, all the way. We needed another life for her. She needed to be an elephant, not a dog or a daughter. Come on, hurry. Come on. Isn't that adorable?
It's adorable.
Could you have her here?
Not at the present time.
Yeah. There aren't really any good options. I could give her to a zoo, but I want her to have a better life than that. That's all right. I'm not leaving you.
It's okay.
She totally misbehaved. She acted out.
You just flunked down this orphanage and expected to get along fine, and she didn't. And I blamed it on you. Flora is the example of all that can go wrong with the best of intentions.
We searched a lot of different places, and none of them seemed right for Flora. You know, I loved her, and she loved me, as simple as that.
And John, if you're ready, we can see the second trailer.
Вот такого я не видела, чтобы усыновляли чернокожих детей. Вот этого я не видела, не слышала.
Я сделала большое преступление, воспитывать своих детей.
Пожелай мне удачи, мама, меня зовет дорога. Ты закачешь, мама, меня не будет долго. Я знаю, знаешь, мама, я знаю, веришь, мама. Ты верил, ты веришь в меня, и это немало. И когда сбивала судьба меня с ног, сквозь боль и отчаяние слышал голос. Сразу, это было голос, живи силы, ты веришь.
Я, блядь, сейчас сказал,
Мама у нас вождь, да? Ставим себя на этого вождь народа.
С него получился студент, но с него не получился сын, и с него не получился человек.
And while John's going to line up the third clip, the trailer for How to Die in Oregon, Peter, perhaps just to give him some time to do that, you could tell us a little bit about the impetus for making that film. this is clearly a subject that's a very controversial subject. In 1994, Oregon was the first state in the US to allow physician-assisted suicide. Was your idea, was your interest personal or was it political?
Well, in a way, my interest was strangely, given the how emotional the subject is, my interest was in a way almost coincidental. It really came just out of this sort of strange event. I've lived most of my life in Oregon, and my first film was Another Oregon Story, and I had just completed that film. It was 2006, and it was actually the day that I was leaving for Sundance with that film. Happened to be the day that the United States Supreme Court ruling upholding Oregon's law was announced. The law had been challenged by the Bush administration at the time, by their Attorney General, went all the way to the Supreme Court and was ultimately upheld. And it was literally the day that I was leaving for the festival. I saw this headline on a newspaper and just knew immediately that would be the next film that I would make. So I came into it kind of blindly in a way. It was a law, of course, that I was aware of, having grown up in Oregon, but not something that I had personal experience with. Certainly I had had family members die, but none of them had availed themselves of the law. So it was kind of in that manner that I went into it, and then it was at about a year later that I actually started making the film. And I think in that year is where the more sort of personal motivation came from, of really questioning whether I was had the wherewithal or was up for making this film, given how difficult of a journey it would be to make it. And a lot of people really warned me about that, I was 27 at the time, and, Peter, do you really think that you're cut out to do this? And also, I think you're really kind of questioning, well, what could this film be? How does it be? How can it be sort of just... I think what I really wanted to do was just really focus on not telling so much a political story or focusing on political, but really focusing on the personal and approaching it as really kind of from a storytelling perspective rather than an activist or even in a way a journalistic perspective. And I think over that year, what I discovered is that there had been a lot of theoretical conversation about what this law meant and why people might use it and how it might affect society, but there was very little kind of primary information, if you will, about the experience of people who were really going through it. And I think if there was an activist call, I felt it was to tell their story, and it hadn't been told yet in Oregon. And I think the reason for that is because it's a very difficult story to tell. So I felt that here I was, a documentary filmmaker living in Oregon, and I felt in a way a sense of duty almost to kind of tell this story.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, let's have a look at that one too.
Before you take the medication, I'm going to ask you just 2 questions.
Sure.
You have the right to change your mind.
My mind's not changing.
And what will this medication do?
It will kill me and make me happy.
Death with dignity. The other side calls it assisted suicide.
I was diagnosed with cancer. I was supposed to have 6 months.
Well, these people have lost so much control, and they'll tell us repeatedly they want the medication for control.
It's this curious limbo. You don't know what's really going to happen, except with Death with Dignity, you do have some control over what's going to happen.
An online survey of physicians showed 50% in favor, 42% against.
We have a tradition in this country to allow patients to deny care, but we've never allowed physicians to actively take somebody's life. That's not the practice of medicine.
First, harm is going to be different for every patient.
So how are you feeling?
Harm for some patients is saying, no, you've got to do this the way your body decides as opposed to the way you decide. My son has a little trouble with this.
She says the cancer's come back. I have 6 months to live, and things are going to be fine. That sounds like the opposite of fine.
If I'm in that bed and I'm racked up with a stroke, that's the decent thing to do. So for once in my life, I'll be decent.
If I had an option, I would prefer not to die. Thank you very much.
The organ law's been thoroughly tested. Now it's time to get it going in other states.
I just think a society has to be asked, this is what we really want. My husband did not feel that any government or any religious leader had the right to tell him how long he had to suffer. I understand there's a kind of dignity in suffering, but there's a certain grace in accepting the inevitable. Anymore.
I think all of us would like to have some options of how we take control of our life at the end.
Julia, I was curious watching your film. You'd made a film about adoption before. Did this film grow out of that? I want to talk about the roots of these films and particularly this question of having a political or a progressive agenda. Your film actually begins with clips of a neo-Nazi march in Kiev, and even from the title, you're foregrounding this multicultural question. Was that the intention from the start?
If we talk about this particular film and objectivity, for me, the story about racism in this film is secondary. But it's for me. For the North American audience, it is very important because it's the setting. What is important is this, the relationship between the mother and the children. And I feel that each of us, when we watch something about the mother and the children, we remember our childhood and our relations with the mothers. And I don't know a single person who had simple relations. So it depends how you feel at that particular moment. That's what you would remember. So when I was making a film about a mother, the mother, and she is foster mother, but she has raised in her life 27 children. It was very difficult to stay objective in a way, because she was doing things that were so polar. So one moment I could see her as a completely perfect saint person, and the other day she would be the worst possible, like, bitch, especially towards talented children that she had. So as a director, when you have the abundance of footage like that, it's on both levels. As a human being and as a director, you get to, let's say, you immerse a lot into the project, so you can lose objectivity because you're so in there, and you also have some scores in your life to do with this film, with your family, for example, right? So. And in my film, I had about 10 scenes where she masterfully manipulates and puts the blame in the head of the boy who wants to play soccer. So if I keep a certain amount of the scenes in the film, she would come across as the evil. So that was an interesting thing in terms of objectivity. That's why when I learned about the panel, I thought it would be a very interesting panel for people who want to make films, because we cannot exactly stay objective, but we can try to be close to objectiveness, being objective. With the topics of your film, right, you have lovable elephant and excellent man, right? So it's easier.
It's actually, I found it more complicated than that, but I don't know where you want to go next.
I'm sorry, yes.
You can take it from there. Certainly, yours is another film which was a long time in gestation, right? I mean, the first, you could take the story back to 1980, was it, the elephant was born? 82, its mother was killed. But you started filming in 2000, is that right? So you were following this story for nearly a decade.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the origins of the story are a dear friend of mine who's a film composer, Miriam Cutler. She'd been the resident composer for Circus Flora for almost since its inception. And so when she heard that David wanted to retire Flora, she thought it'd be a great film. David wanted to take Flora back to Africa, to repatriate her, but to find a way that she could live there because she couldn't fend for herself, obviously. And she called me right away, and I said, I'm sorry, I don't do films about animals. I make films about people. So she found our producers, who was incredible synchronicity, Christina Colissimo. Her dad had been one of the founders of the Miami Metro Zoo, but Miriam didn't even know that at the time. So anyway, so then we found ourselves in St. Louis on a kind of a spec shoot on Flora's final performance weekend. And David was still trying to make plans to get her to Africa. And then he started to hear terrible things. You know, you can't protect even elephants in reserves from poaching. There's still poaching going on. So he thought he better rethink this quickly. And he put the brakes on an immediate trip back to Africa, at which point any potential funding, any interest from the funders fell out immediately. So I had to go on to other jobs. And really, Christina and Jordana, the two producers, shot sporadically trying to follow the story. And they also got very involved in the story. I mean, talk about objectivity or subjectivity, because they formed a nonprofit called Gray Matters that was responsible for finding a home, the right home for Flora, and really supported David and were responsible for getting her to Miami initially as a way station. So, but in terms of what you were saying, Julia, I mean, I found the elephant completely inscrutable. And, you know, elephants, they're not expressive like other mammals, dogs, for instance, where you can project. So we're all projecting, and that's one of the questions of the film, is how much are we projecting on these animals? So there's no way to keep objectivity about that. And David's actually really complex. I mean, I don't think he's not a saint. And we'll talk more about this, but I'd said to you before that I don't believe there's any objectivity. And in fact, my goal is not objectivity. My goal is to find the greater truth in a situation, which sounds pompous, but like my truth, basically. So I feel like journalism, we need objectivity in journalism because we need our news as unfiltered as possible, even though it is filtered by writers, you know, perspectives and backgrounds. But the documentary as a form, I believe, is really interpretive. And I think that's the point. So I'm always looking for my point of view, and my point of view became, through the making of the film, this is a story of a man trying to right a wrong he didn't even know he was committing at the time in the 80s, and really can never fully write, because Flora became a fish out of water and stuck between the animal world and the human world, fitting really fully in neither.
Mm-hmm. So I'm hearing you all kind of backing away from any claim to objectivity. Is that right? I mean, Peter, because your film is the most overtly political, I imagine there must have been the most pressure on you to handle that question. And your film does make some space for people making the counter-argument, people who really think that that this is leading us towards euthanasia. But it's not much space, and you only follow one terminal patient who is appalled by the idea of physician-assisted suicide, and he noticeably is not an urban, well-educated liberal. So why did you choose him?
Yeah, so there's you know, a number of kind of different parts of that. I think one, in terms of the film or the balance in the film, that was really kind of a question of, for me, of, you know, like Lisa was saying, of point of view, of story, and what the film that I wanted to make as a filmmaker was not this side, then that side, then this side, then that side, which I had kind of done with my first film, in the story of the microcosm of this small town, because that's what I thought the story was, and the most interesting story, and the one that I wanted to explore. But in this film, I was totally focused on, you know, these very personal experiences of people going through the law, which would naturally lead me down a certain path in terms of balance, let's say, around the issue. And I just kind of said, well, so be it. You know, I know why I'm making this film, which is a desire to tell the story, not to make a political point. So I think there is a presumption, at least in the US, that every documentary made now has some sort of political message. And certainly when you take on a hot issue, everyone is going in looking for, well, what's the filmmaker side? And of course I get that question all the time. So, and I try to explain to people that, well, it wasn't a question of politics, it was a question of story and filmmaking, and I think some people hear that and some people don't. And in terms of, you know, which stories of the opposition I chose to include in the film, I didn't want to, it was again a stylistic choice of, I didn't want to feel the filmmaker's hand, my own hand, inserting the other side just to kind of make sure it's included in there somewhere. I wanted the other side to always be included in the context of either one of the main characters' stories, or in a way that felt diegetic, if you will, you know, that felt of a whole of the film. So the choice to include Randy Stroop's story, which is the man you referred to, this is a man in Oregon who had a terminal cancer diagnosis. He was a very low income. He was on the what we have in the United States, the Medicaid program, which is for healthcare for people who are of low income, can't afford to buy care on their own. And he had received a cancer diagnosis. His doctor had prescribed a treatment, and the state refused to pay for the treatment because it didn't meet their guideline of extending his life, having at least a 5% chance of extending his life by more than 5 years. So he received a letter from the state saying, we can't pay for your cancer treatment, but we can offer you palliative end-of-life comfort options. And of course, in Oregon, one of those options is death with dignity. So he received a letter from the state, and the way he kind of explains it is, we won't pay to cure you, but we'll pay to kill you, right? So the decision to include that story, one, it was a matter of timeliness. It was happening, this story was unfolding just as I was making the film. And also, for me, it was one of the first times, if not the first time, in Oregon where there was a sort of if you will, a chink in the armor. Oregon's law had functioned very successfully in the sense of success being defined as what voters thought they were voting for. And then this story emerged as, wow, this is actually someone who's not opposed to it because of philosophical or religious grounds, but was directly harmed by it. So that's why I decided to include that story. Yeah, go ahead.
Julia, I want to pick up on something you said, that in the West, this issue of racism and multiculturalism is very important, but it doesn't seem so important to you. But
of course,
was it important in terms of, are you talking about in finding the funding, in financing the film?
No.
Or?
This topic is very important to me. This topic is why I chose to make this film.
Okay.
Because of racism, because of the children who are born in a particular country. They have no idea who the African fathers are because they were students and they had affairs with local girls, and the children were born left at the orphanages. They never saw their fathers. They have 0% of African heritage, and everybody looks at them and treats them as if they are lesser humans and they don't belong. So for me it was extremely important. When you start to film, your priorities shift with anybody who is filming. So in this particular family, the complexity of the people in the family and the conflicts, the universal conflicts, because filmmakers always look for universal things that people would relate to, right? So what I found in this family was, for me, sort of big on a philosophical level, because racism is abnormality. So it's easy sort of show what it is and that it is bad, right? But then when you show the relationship between the mother and, let's say, an intellectual child who is smarter than the mother, and you show the mother who can love and forgive all the children that are not as smart as she is and not as strong, and she really clashes with the only one who is, let's say, who is born with better and more capacities than she has. And as a human being, of course, you look at that. But in terms of objectivity, what I wanted to say is, and I would think that every one of us feel that the huge challenge for any filmmaker is a person lets you in their house. They let you stay, film for a year, 2 or 3. And of course you film this and that, and each person who let you in the house, they want to be shown in a particular positive way. And then you feel guilty because you don't do it, and you feel as a user and as if you betrayed them. So it's a very difficult balance because you actually like this person, but this person is not one-dimensional. But every single person who is in the film will be offended by certain things that you want to include. So it's such a difficult thing.
Can I jump in for
Please.
a second? So the New Yorker writer Janet Malcolm wrote a book called The Journalist and the Murderer. And I wrote an article once about documentary ethics, and I quoted her, but I said substitute the word documentarian for journalist. And she says, she opens her book, I think, with saying that every act of journalism is ultimately an act of seduction that ends ultimately in an act of betrayal. Even if you're totally on the side of your subject, just the fact that your existential perspective is going to be different than your subject, and how you see him will be different than how he sees himself, ultimately it's an act of betrayal, which is very sobering. And that's kind of what you're talking about, right?
So in the case of your film, you have this very strong character, David Balding, the circus owner, who loves this elephant. And he comes into conflict with the woman he eventually, I don't think this is a spoiler, finds a sanctuary that will...
Don't tell them where Flora ends up. But there are many steps on the journey.
He does come into conflict with another animal carer, which is a philosophical conflict. And I mean, he's a very intelligent and sensitive guy, and it doesn't become brutal between them, but it's a huge rift. And you spend a lot of time with both of them, and you have to find some kind, navigate a path between those two very mutually exclusive points of view of how the animal should be treated.
Right, and again, I wasn't striving for objectivity about that. I was striving, I find documentary filmmaking is a process of discovery, you know, for myself personally, and so it was striving to understand what was really going on. And so I have two protagonists, the elephant and the human, David, and then Carol became a sort of antagonist in David's life. But the challenge for me was I was really more philosophically aligned with Carol, the quote antagonist, even than my protagonist. So that was very challenging. And you know, so David very early on opened up his life to us. We had access. Miriam had known him. Christina bonded with him. I forgot to say that, you know, when the funding fell out and I went on to other jobs, so Christina and Jordana filmed for about 6 or 7 years, and then we thought, let's revive this film. And I cut a trailer, and we got funding. And so then we spent 2 years finishing the film. So David opened up early on, but Carol, it took me 9 months to persuade Carol to let me go film at the Sanctuary. That was really hard. She thought I was aligned with David. You know, they were arguing about, there was a time when David wasn't, it's hard not to talk about this film without spoilers, but where David's not allowed to see Flora for a while. And I tried to say to Carol, look, I'm a child of divorce, and for me the answer was always more contact, not less contact. So I had to try all angles just to get there. But, so I guess, let's see, how was I going to wrap this up? That ultimately, you know, their division, sure, that's conflict for a film, but ultimately it was a greater point for me. It was like the story of the 5 blind men. They're all describing what the elephant is, but it's a different part, so they all are describing it, an elephant as a completely different entity, which I was dying to use in the film and never fit in. We even filmed sequences, we tried everything, but it just didn't fit. But so the fact that we're snatching these animals out of the wild and putting them in captivity and training them, teaching them to do tricks and dominating them, it's like Carol and David's argument is just kind of embodying this bigger problem that we have. Like what we're doing with other species is what we're doing to the planet, to dire results, right? Dominating and not thinking about what the results are. And so really the difference is everyone was projecting onto Flora. Willie too, the guy from Pittsburgh, the Pittsburgh Zoo, who's a great guy. They're all great people. They all thought they knew what was best for Flora, and nobody really knows what's best for Flora. And that was really my point. So it wasn't about who's right, it was a meta point of view. if that makes sense.
Peter, for you, that sense of responsibility to the characters in your film must be even more acute, because you spent the last few months of their life with them, documenting that, which couldn't get much more intimate. And you had to negotiate your own access, even to the point of death. Was it difficult to leave yourself out of the film?
It was difficult to leave myself out of the film, certainly, and you know, I built these kind of long-term relationships with the families, and they continue, and in a way, the intimacy of the film is you know, partly because I became close to the families. But I think I was fortunate in the sense that there was an implied understanding between myself and them of, we may grow close, but it's still ultimately you are making a film about us, and there is a certain remove or professionalism that implies. Yet at the same time, we were always walking this line of you know, real intimacy and being in these moments. And how do you can't just be a totally kind of antiseptic, removed stranger and be there for these moments. So it was I think something that was never kind of talked about explicitly, because how do you talk to your subjects, you know, or the people you're filming with, you know, about well, how intimate is this relationship going to be? It just kind of evolves, and in a way, it's reflected in the style of the film, especially in Cody's story, where you know, the beginning of when you first see her, it's kind of this more formal sit-down interview, and then and in that situation, I was sitting in a chair across from her, and there was a cameraman there, and we were having a more certainly a very personal and intimate conversation about her, but it was more removed than later interviews, which were conducted just Cody and I sitting on her couch with the camera on my shoulder, and so I think that that kind of the growth and intimacy in our relationship is reflected over the course of the film. And I think that the you know, to the question of kind of objectivity and betrayal, that was something that I really thought about and struggled with. Of, I feel a primary responsibility to these people that I'm filming with, and I cannot betray them. Yet at the same time, I am making a film about a highly controversial subject, and to not somehow address the other side would be, first of all, a disservice to the film, and in a way the people who are letting me tell their stories, and also to the audience. You know, it would be a discredit to the film. So there was a question of, well, how to include the other side, these dissenting viewpoints, but in a way that isn't ultimately offensive or hurtful to these people who have let me into their most intimate moments. So that was a real challenge. And even when you know, I showed the family the film before it had its premiere, I was really concerned about, like Randy Stroop's story, for instance, Samantha receives this letter, other dissenting viewpoints, that they would be really hurt by that and feel betrayed. And I didn't really know what I was going to do if they said, well, you can't put this in. You know, look at how this makes Cody, you know, the main character, look. And I was very fortunate in the sense that, well, I was fortunate that they didn't say that, they didn't object. And in fact, miraculously, Cody's husband, Stan, when I watched the film with him, one of his favorite characters was Randy Stroop, because it reminded him of a lot of people in his family. He came from a Christian Science background, so he understood that viewpoint. So there was a great, you know, sort of magnanimous outlook he had, and he understood that this was a part of the story, you know, including that. So, but that was a very difficult thing, and you know, something going into earning someone's trust and respect. How do you explain to them, well, I'm going to tell your story, but I'm also going to tell, you know, what's wrong with your viewpoint, you know. And unfortunately, that wasn't really the film I wanted to make, but that was a real challenge in making the film.
John, I don't know which clip you have lined up next, but if we'll go to one of the clips in a moment, and either How to Die in Oregon or Family Portrait would be fine at this point. You ready to go? Okay, let's show the clip because I think this
If-
will illustrate some of these.
If it is family portrait, then I wanted to say one thing that is important to say because it's just a clip. So everything in this film is not exactly what you see, right? So there was a boy in the film, and he had huge conflict with the mother. He left. He had 2 friends. Everybody else sort of kept their distance when they saw that the mother has a sour relationship with him. They stopped communicating with him. So, but he had 2 friends, and they stayed behind. And so that's a hint.
Ось, мам, дивіться. Це наша школа. Ось ти хочу. Спасибо.
Oh.
Ну, нету хороших условий тут для меня. Ко мне тут относятся не очень хорошо. А почему, я сам не знаю. Ну, вот я считаю, что это мне не семья. Ну, я живу в семейном детском доме.
Ты убирай. Что ты красивая с белой ниткой? Убирай! Чей портфель? Я его выкину в мусор. Быстро. Убирай! Что за рубашка? Это вчера мне Сережа. А что тут Сережа уже вещами командует? Я сказала, командую парадом, я в доме. Ну что это делается? Так ты видишь, ты как бы переодеваться. Я надеюсь, эта собака не наша? Я очень надеюсь, что эта собака не наша.
Yeah, I think it's funny because you watch at least the first 30 minutes of your film and you think that the foster mother, Olga, is an amazing woman and that with all the troubles, the poverty that she's living in, she's doing a remarkable job. And then you go back the next year and the year after that and your attitude to her completely flips. But that was a structural device, was it? That was something that you put together in the editing rather than a reflection of your own feelings towards her changing.
Right, that's true. So first of all, it depends which country you show the film at. Like if you show it in Russia, she will be seen completely as a very, very solely positive person, because it's not that she's evil, it's just her methods are the Soviet methods. So that's important. Yeah, so the film comes in editing. That's what happens. So you're structuring the film, you're making choices. and you put certain image of your subjects in the beginning, then you change it because it must change all the time, right? It shouldn't stay the same way. Here we have actually two parts of the film put together, and I did it yesterday. Maybe I overdid some at the second part. I don't know because it's, of course there are things between them, but. Well, what can I say? It's everything is in the editing, and you are trying to stay objective. But I have to admit, she hasn't seen the film, and she will not see the film the way it is seen by the audience, because I'm afraid she will retaliate, and not to me. I don't care. She will be vindictive to the children that criticized her. So I cut a version for her that doesn't have like any of the children saying a single word against her, except for this boy, for the boy who was who left the family. And anyway, he was the most vocal. And in any case, like his philosophical assessment are the most important. So that's one thing. And another thing, I'm very worried it will end up on the internet, and I'm protecting it. Because I'm afraid she will be vindictive to the children, because she can be very vindictive.
Wow. I've never heard of a director doing that before.
And I would never do it before if it wasn't for these particular circumstances. But when you have a very complex person you're dealing with, it is like I will give an example of how complex she is. So I called her when I learned about this story. I called her and she said, yeah, great, come for sure. I said, I will buy the ticket, I will call you back. I called her in a week and she said, you know, actually, I went to the authorities and I told them that if they don't fix the roof, a Canadian crew is coming and the whole world will find out that they are not helping us at all. And the authorities told me that they are giving me a very friendly advice to tell the Canadian crew not to come. And she said, so, Julia, I guess it's, you know, it's serious. You shouldn't come. And I said, Olga, I don't know what to do. I bought the ticket. And she said, you bought the ticket. Well, then, of course, come. So she has her own very strong set of values, and she operates within them. So if, like, I didn't raise 20 children. I have one teenager, she is 19, and I didn't have it right anyway. Like, there is no one who has it right. So when you're editing a film about parenthood, you have to remember who you are, actually, because from the distance, you can say, this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong. But there were, when you're editing, there are certain topics that I believe she is wrong, and she knows she is wrong. And they're making harm to the children in the long run. For example, her stubborn refusal to allow international adoption, because they're foster children. So the international adoption, I went all the way, because I blame her for not doing it. In terms of parenting skills, I put both sides, because nobody is perfect. So that kind of thing, something that is important, and I think it's her fault, I went all the way.
Can I just, we've got about 15, 16 minutes left, so I will get to your questions, but just as a last question and brief answers, please. Were there times where you spent so long with these people, over months and years in some cases, where you would intervene as a friend? I mean, would you give advice? Would you talk to Olga and say, well, maybe you're being a little harsh here? And mediate between David and...
Yeah, I mean, I urged David to call Carol and reinitiate a conversation. I mean, I think David's, he avoids conflict, you know, and he kind of resigned himself to not being allowed to see Flora. And you walk a tightrope, you know, with influencing that reality. And it's interesting because I think David thought that the film would open up doors for him. He thought the film, we'd come in and so that magically Carol would change her mind And so he, you know, he was thinking he was using us, really. And so we were saying, well, you've got, you know, we can't do that. You can do it, and we'll film it. And so then that kind of re-upped the ante of him calling Carol repeatedly and trying to open that dialogue again. Yeah. Short answer.
There was never a time when I kind of inserted myself into the families, the various people I film with, you know, suggesting they do something. I think maybe the closest, you know, I got to having a direct role in their family relationships, aside from, you know, being there as a presence and documenting them, was with Cody's children, who were initially very reluctant to participate in the film and be on camera or give interviews. They eventually agreed because I think Cody kind of lobbied them basically, and they agreed for her. And then once they did the interviews, one, they were very, very open in them, and very emotionally open. And later, after the film was finished, they told me that they felt like the interviews were kind of free therapy, that I was this sort of, you know, in a way, they said, you know, disinterested party, even though of course I was making a film about them, but I was someone they could confide in who wasn't a friend or their mother or their father. As conversant as the family is in the film, this was still very, very, in a way the film did become a catalyst for that conversation, and they were as reluctant, I think, as any other individual or family is to have it. And we're just hoping they wouldn't have to, but then the film kind of forced the issue in a way, so that did happen.
Can I just say something really quickly? My first film was a portrait, Metamorphosis, a portrait of someone going through a sex change, a man becoming a woman. We followed over 3 years. And I was doing audio interviews every 2 weeks with her, because we couldn't afford to film. It was in 16 millimeter. And she was totally using me as her shrink. And I had to say many, many times, Gabby, I'm not a psychologist. Please call your psychologist. And in fact, I ended up having to kind of very consciously wean her off of me at the end of the film, because we had that kind of very dependent relationship.
Mm-hmm. Well, in our case, it was a funny story, but she is a person like no other in a way. So I think why I was a great friend with the children, because I myself understood in about 3 minutes after I met her that she is stronger than I am, and I cannot challenge her because there is no point. She's stronger. So children asked me in about several days, like, how you feel around our mother? And they looked at me like with a twinkle in their eyes, and they said, I feel like you guys, like I'm one of you. And that was the dynamic. So I challenged her in 3 years 3 times. And every time it would be the last day of the shoot, because every year I thought it's the last day of the shoot of the film. So the last day she would agree for an interview. She didn't want any interviews. So she allowed full access, but no interviews, 0. So the last day, she would agree, she would sit down or stand, whatever, and I would challenge her. And she never took it as if I am an aggressor, but I wasn't able to change like that much in her opinions. Of course, I intervened in a different way. And I actually paid for it as a filmmaker because obviously, I was a friend with the boy whom she basically threw out the 2nd year. And I met with him, I filmed him, I helped him, I continue to help him. And when she learned, she didn't say anything, but she didn't allow children to, let's say, give me interviews or like to keep the distance. So the 2nd year, and especially the 3rd year, she was a way more distant with me. Yeah. But I don't regret. Yeah. Because I think, first of all, we're humans. And I would never forget one thing. Several years ago, there was a film here at the festival. It was done by an American director. Her name is Julia Loktev. And she filmed her parents. And her father had a stroke. And there was a scene where her mother was pushing the stroller, and the filmmaker, the daughter, was standing there. And the stroller, of course, the father was in this stroller. Stroller, yes? So the mother was pushing it, and the father almost flipped, and her camera didn't shake. And for me, this filmmaker, I have no respect for her, honestly, because first of all, she's a daughter, and the fact that her camera didn't even shake, for me it was like that distance from your subjects, because they're human beings. You cannot have such distance. I think you shouldn't.
Okay, I want to open it up to you guys. We have microphones for questions, so if you could raise your hand, I'll point to you, and then someone will bring you a microphone. And if down here at the front first, someone who wants to raise their hand for the second question, then we can get a mic to you.
Hi, I was just, this is a question for all three of you. I was wondering, at some point when you were filming, did you ever consider, quitting? You didn't want to film anymore due to circumstances?
During the editing, not so much the filming. The editing of One Lucky Elephant was so challenging. I mean, of course I would never give up. In fact, I have friends that urge me to just wrap it up, just finish it, And I was like, no, it's not there yet. But not really during the shooting.
I didn't ever consider quitting with this film. With my first film, I got about halfway in, and it's your first film, and maybe you're not going to have to be a filmmaker. So there was a kind of crisis moment there, which coincided with my hard drive crashing and being rejected from Sundance. So this was this cacophony, and then there was a real question of, I'm just going to move on to other things, and then I didn't, and then spent another year reconstructing the film. With this film. The only thing that was kind of like that was I almost stopped filming because I thought I was done, and then I met Cody, who's the main character. So I actually didn't meet her and her family until I've been filming for about 2 years.
Wow.
And I was just about to stop filming, and in fact, my access, because of other situations that were going on, was maybe going to be cut off to anyone that I was filming with, and then I met her and her family, and then filmed with them for 10 months. So that was definitely a very important moment that happened.
I actually understand very well your question, not with this particular film, but sometimes you have people who are not opening up, or you don't like them. But you haven't filmed everything, and you're filming and filming, but they're still not opening up. And you don't like them more and more. So, of course, you want to quit. But I think when you start the career in filmmaking, you're more inclined to quit, but you shouldn't. Because you have to overcome this challenge, and you must find some ways around it, and you must finish the film.
You need to know what your story is. As long as you know what your story is, that's your northern star, And that'll take you to the end. And it's easy to forget and get really fuzzy about, where am I going with this film again? Because it's not giving you what you think that you need, because the film starts to tell you what the film is, as opposed to you imposing your own perspective on it.
Question about
A question for Peter. You say that Oregon is the first state to bring in the assisted suicide law, and raises the obvious question, what are the other states? And if it had been one of these other states, say California, that was the first to do it, how would that change your approach to making the film?
Well, the other state to have legalized it is Washington State, which is a story that's covered in the film. So Oregon legalized it in '94. The state legislature actually sent it back to the voters saying, did you really mean to legalize this? And they passed it again in 1997. So it's been law since '97, and then Washington State just legalized it in 2008. And it's also legal in Montana, although through a judicial challenge, so it's not really kind of codified. It's just, they're saying, well, there's nothing in the Constitution that explicitly forbids this. And then Vermont and Massachusetts are the two states now that are going to consider it. And I've never really thought about how the film, whether I would have made the film or how it would have been different if it was in a different state. I think probably it would have been far less intimate in a way. I mean, when I was making the film, I was kind of like, it was kind of like being a doctor on call. I really couldn't go anywhere. I always had to be ready. And some of the people I was filming with were very far away, a 5 or 6 hour drive sometimes. But interestingly, Cody, or luckily, Cody and her family lived about 7 minutes from where I lived. So I could be there at a moment's notice. And there was just something about, telling a story about someone who was in your community that I think it's in an invisible way. It's in the film. That my familiarity with her neighborhood, the city. There is a shared sensibility there. Maybe even more for her than for me, that she understood where I was coming from, and I wasn't seen so much as an outsider, but as someone much more familiar. So I definitely think that affected the film.
It's so much easier to make a film when you live in the area, and then you're having to land into St. Louis, and then you're spending 4 days there, and then you have to leave, and how you capture natural life. It's really challenging to make a film in a different place. I mean, we all do it, but it's harder.
And it would have been very, very difficult to make this film in particular if you were making it from a long distance. I don't know how. I mean, certainly you could do it, but it would be very different. So it wasn't a subject that lended itself to long distance filmmaking.
Yeah, I guess in sort of a summation of what's been discussed here, it seems to me the process is sort of schizophrenic and disassociative, so that you have to wear one hat as the director and try and be factual and objective, coming from a place already impassioned, otherwise you wouldn't be making the film. You must have been motivated to make the film, but then to get out of your own way and to allow the film to have its own direction, in a sense, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think that objective and fair are not synonymous, at least in documentaries. So to be objective to me seems like it's neutral, and yeah, maybe we have to define our terms. So I never want to be neutral. I have a point of view. It may not be, it's not a polemic. I've never made a polemic film. In fact, I believe social issues are best told through character and story, because it reaches people through their heart, and then it goes up to their mind as opposed to intellectually. And I think all of us made character-driven films that make that point. But to be fair is a different thing, and I do aspire for that.
And I wanted to say that in editing, when you're choosing what to put in, that's where you're not a victim that is conflicted, because in editing everything you're in control, you're the creator, right? So, and then you are doing it in a very manipulative way, because nobody should notice that you're actually influencing the reality, because then it becomes propaganda, or it's not good when you can see that something is manipulated, right? But let's say in the clip that I showed, of course, when Olga at the end was yelling at this boy, and then the kids are sitting there, and they have several shots of different kids, and it's her voice yelling again. And of course, it didn't happen this way. I liked the shots, I knew what I want to say, and I created as if it is a scene, but it never existed. So we have our time of revenge for all this time that we didn't allow ourselves to say anything while filming. Because, yeah, while filming, we cannot have a serious confrontation.
Yeah, I've joked about the small t and the big T. The small t is the literal truth, and the big T is really the poetic, the uber truth of what's going on, as you see it.
And at least as the audience, we can accept it or reject it. Yeah. Nobody's forcing us. We have time for, I think, 1 or 2 more questions. Yeah.
Hi. Question about the filming process. I find a lot of the time the subjects will almost sort of look to you for guidance in when you're shooting. Like kind of, what do you want me to do? Should I go over here? You know what I mean? And so I find that I struggle a bit with trying to, just be natural and I'll film you, right? And then they kind of wonder, well, what do I do when I'm natural? And so how do you sort of draw the line between, giving them guidance in the sense because they're looking for it, and then not wanting to influence how you're actually shooting, whether it's like, hey, can you stand by that window because it looks nice? You know what I mean? Like, where's the line there?
I think that was kind of something I struggled with earlier in making in this film, and I think a lot of it depends on what you're filming and what it is, how active your characters, your protagonists. I mean, I hate using those terms because these are real people, but the people you're filming, how active they are, and there were definitely situations with individuals I was filming on early on who were far less active than Cody and her family, where I really struggled with, well, I want to tell this person's story, but what do I film? What are they doing? And of course, people are at the end of life, so they're not terribly active. And it never got to the point where I was saying, well, why don't you do this, or why don't you go to the park, or something like that. It was just, well, there wasn't necessarily a lot of material there. And then when I met Cody and her family, she was really relatively active. And then it was just a question of, what do I film? What will I be allowed to film? What will she give me permission to be there for? And what will her family allow me to do? And just trying to be there as much as possible. And then when I was there, I would basically just tell them I was filming by myself, so there wasn't even a sound person there, and I would just basically tell them, well, I'm going to disappear now, and they got it. They understood. Okay, we're going to kind of go on, and they would tell me, at the end of filming that, oh, Peter, we forgot that you were there, and I don't know if they were just being generous or if they really did. I think that sometimes they really did. I was present for a number of doctor's visits that were very, as you might imagine, very intense, and it was a very small room, and I was very close, but I really felt as I was filming it, and I think that in the scenes it comes off as it's the filmmaker's presence is pretty invisible. There's one clip in particular, I don't know if we really have time to show it, it's about 60 seconds, but if you see the film, it's towards the end in a hair salon, and that was a very, very probably the most intimate part in the film, and one where certainly Cody was aware of my presence, but chose to ignore it and kind of in a way give a gift to the film that I think was really extraordinary and showed a real kind of collaboration that can happen, between a filmmaker and their subject.
Well, why don't we finish with that brief clip? Can't do it? It's Siobhan's fault. Okay.
Can then I add something? Question number one, do you have a camera? If you own the camera, it's one story. If you're bringing the crew, you cannot expect to have any spontaneous actions. And also it depends on, I think, on the people. Some people are a way more sort of alert to what the film is. So they will be doing things, and it's not that they're acting for the camera, but they are good subjects for the document. And some people might never relax. But also I wanted to say that I heard the director of The Position Among the Stars talking, and he said one thing that I really enjoyed. And The Position Among the Stars is a film that's playing here at the festival, and it won jury prize at Sundance and best prize at ITFA. So we are in a situation that nobody can make this film because he filmed it for 12 years, 3 films, the same family, and he lived for 12 months basically with this family. So we cannot have this kind of people in normal life to film. But he said he never tells them what to do. And he is filming what is happening. And he filmed a very good scene that didn't have the beginning. And all he had to do to film is the person entering the door. But he didn't tell the person, please walk in, because he never ever tells his subject, as he says, it doesn't mean it's true, to do something for him. So he said that, I said, can you bring me the keys from my car? Right? So the person went and came back. But I was thinking the person could walk in, stop by the door and say, here are your keys, right? What are the chances? But basically that's how he explained. So we should be more creative in the way how to make our subjects doing something without telling them to stand near the window. Maybe to ask them whether there is an intruder in the backyard.
Okay, I want to thank you guys for coming, and Julia, Peter, and Lisa for your great insights and thoughts, and Rogers for sponsoring this session. All their films are playing at least twice through VIF, and I think at least Lisa and Julia will be attending the screenings, and we'll do Q&As, so you should go along. If you haven't had the chance to ask your question now, you can ask them then. Thank you.
Thank you.